March 17, 1945. The air above the Rhine River trembled with the sound of 10,000 engines. In the early morning fog that clung to the water like a shroud, General Major Friedrich von Leoben stood in the stone watchtower of a half-destroyed fortress near Remagen, his field glasses pressed against his face until the metal bit into his cheekbones. What he saw defied everything he had learned in 30 years of Prussian military tradition. Across the river, where his training told him there should be orderly columns advancing in textbook formation, there was instead a kind of controlled chaos that made his stomach turn. American soldiers moved in clusters, some smoking cigarettes, others chewing gum with their helmets pushed back on their heads. A few were listening to a portable radio someone had set up on the hood of a jeep. And even from this distance, von Leoben could hear the faint pulse of jazz music drifting across the water. Behind them, an endless procession of vehicles stretched to the horizon: trucks, tanks, jeeps, ambulances, supply carriers, each one seemingly identical to the last, rolling forward with mechanical inevitability. The general lowered his glasses and turned to his aide, a young captain whose uniform still carried the creases of parade ground perfection despite 3 years of war. "They have no discipline," von Leoben said quietly, but there was something in his voice that wasn't quite conviction. "They fight like a mob." The captain nodded, but he too had seen something in those American lines that troubled him, something that couldn't be dismissed as mere disorder. They had both read the reports, heard the stories from the Eastern and Western fronts, studied the intelligence summaries that grew more alarming each month. And yet, standing here in the cold dawn, watching the Americans prepare to cross the Rhine as if it were simply another river on their way to somewhere inevitable, von Leoben felt the first cold finger of understanding touch his spine. This wasn't just an army. This was something else entirely. Something his training had never prepared him to face. The German military tradition that von Leoben represented stretched back through centuries of carefully cultivated excellence. It was a tradition built on the bedrock of Prussian discipline, where obedience wasn't merely expected, but was the fundamental organizing principle of existence itself. From the military academies where officers learned to recite Clausewitz from memory, to the parade grounds where enlisted men practiced the same movements until they could execute them in their sleep, the German armed forces had constructed a machine of war that valued precision above all else. Every soldier knew his place. Every order followed a chain of command so rigid it might have been forged from steel. The general staff system, perfected over decades, operated with clockwork efficiency, planning operations with mathematical precision, accounting for every variable, every contingency. German officers didn't simply study military history. They lived it, breathed it, saw themselves as the inheritors of a tradition that included Frederick the Great and Helmuth von Moltke. They believed with an almost religious fervor that discipline was the wellspring from which all military virtue flowed. A disciplined army could endure hardship, maintain cohesion under fire, execute complex maneuvers under conditions that would reduce lesser forces to rabble. Discipline meant that when an officer fell, the next man in line would step forward without hesitation. It meant that soldiers would hold their positions until death rather than retreat without orders. It meant that the army functioned as a single organism, each part subordinate to the whole, each individual was subsumed into the collective purpose. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, this philosophy seemed vindicated by the speed and totality of victory. The Wehrmacht swept across Europe like a steel tide, demonstrating to the world what modern warfare looked like when executed with Prussian precision. France fell in 6 weeks. The Low Countries crumbled in days. Yugoslavia and Greece were conquered in a matter of weeks. Even the initial invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, saw German forces advance hundreds of miles in the first months, encircling entire Soviet armies, capturing millions of prisoners. German commanders looked at these victories and saw confirmation of everything they believed. Their system worked. Their discipline, their training, their careful hierarchies and meticulous planning had created the most effective military force on the planet. They read with contempt the early reports about American forces. These citizen soldiers pulled from factories and farms, given a few months of training and shipped overseas. The Americans, German intelligence reported, had no military tradition worth mentioning. Their officer corps was swollen with civilians given commissions after abbreviated training courses. Their enlisted men came from a society that celebrated individualism over collective discipline, where young men grew up questioning authority rather than respecting it. The American military had no heritage of military excellence to draw upon, no philosophical tradition that elevated the soldier's calling to something approaching the sacred. They were, in the estimation of many German officers, shopkeepers and mechanics playing at war. But by 1943, as the tide of war began to turn, disturbing reports started filtering back from commanders who had actually faced the Americans in battle. After the North African campaign, after Sicily, after the grinding advance up the Italian peninsula, German officers began to notice something that didn't fit their theoretical framework. The Americans, for all their apparent lack of traditional discipline, kept coming. They absorbed casualties that would have shattered other armies and returned to the attack. They learned from their mistakes with a speed that seemed impossible. They adapted their tactics, modified their equipment, changed their approach based on battlefield experience rather than waiting for orders from high command. At Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, in February 1943, German forces had inflicted a stinging defeat on American troops, and the Germans had allowed themselves to believe this confirmed their assumptions. Here was proof that inexperienced troops, no matter how well equipped, couldn't stand against the battle-hardened Wehrmacht. But what happened afterward confused them. Instead of the prolonged demoralization that should have followed such a defeat, the Americans analyzed what went wrong, replaced ineffective commanders, reorganized their forces, and came back harder. By the time the North African campaign ended 3 months later, it was the Germans and Italians who were surrendering by the hundreds of thousands. Something wasn't adding up. Oberst Heinrich Müller had been one of the officers who fought in Tunisia, and later in Italy, and by the time he was captured near Monte Cassino in the spring of 1944, he had developed a theory that his fellow officers found almost treasonous. In the POW camp where he spent the remainder of the war, he wrote long letters to his wife that were never sent, letters that survived the war, and provide a remarkable window into the cognitive dissonance experienced by professional German officers. "They don't fight the way we were taught soldiers should fight," he wrote in one letter dated August 1944. "There is no parade ground precision to their movements, no rigid adherence to doctrine, but there is something else, something we never accounted for in our manuals and our war games. They fight as if they have a choice in the matter, as if they are participating in their own war rather than simply executing someone else's plan. And somehow, impossibly, this makes them more effective, not less." Müller went on to describe specific incidents that had shaken his understanding. He wrote about American junior officers and even enlisted men taking initiative in ways that would have resulted in court-martial in the German army, making tactical decisions on their own authority, adapting to changing circumstances without waiting for orders from above. He described how American units that suffered heavy casualties would reorganize themselves on the battlefield. Sergeants taking command of mixed groups from different companies, soldiers from different units fighting together as if they'd trained together for years. "It shouldn't work," he wrote. "Every principle of military science says it shouldn't work. But it does." The first thing that struck German soldiers who encountered American forces was the sheer material abundance. This was something that went beyond simple logistics, beyond the ordinary advantages that accrue to a wealthy nation at war. The Americans seemed to operate under completely different assumptions about what an army needed to function. Where German soldiers counted their ammunition carefully, American riflemen fired with what seemed like reckless abundance. Where German armored units learned to make every shell count, American tank crews seemed to have unlimited ammunition for everything: main guns, machine guns, smoke rounds, illumination rounds. But it wasn't just ammunition. It was everything. Every American soldier seemed to have a raincoat, a sleeping bag, multiple changes of uniform. They had portable stoves for heating rations, water purification tablets, insect repellent, sunscreen, medicated foot powder. Their aid stations were supplied with quantities of plasma, bandages, sulfa drugs, and morphine that German medical officers found almost incomprehensible. One German doctor, captured in Normandy and put to work treating wounded prisoners, wrote in his diary, "The American medical supplies I have seen in one field hospital would be enough to supply an entire German division for months. And they tell me this is normal, that every American medical unit is supplied like this. If this is true, we never had a chance." The food was perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of American material superiority. German soldiers in the later years of the war subsisted on rations that were steadily shrinking in both quantity and quality. By 1944, the standard German field ration often consisted of dark bread that was stretched with sawdust filler, ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns, and thin soups extended with whatever could be foraged. Meat was a rarity. Fresh vegetables were almost unheard of except when they could be requisitioned from local populations. Butter, sugar, chocolate. These had become distant memories. The Wehrmacht fought on half-empty stomachs, and this was considered normal, even virtuous. Prussian tradition held that hardship built character, that the ability to endure deprivation was the mark of a true soldier. Then the Germans encountered American rations, and the psychological impact was profound. C rations, K rations, D rations, even the worst American field rations contained more calories and better nutrition than what German soldiers were receiving. But it was the fresh food that broke something in the German understanding of the war. American units, they discovered, received regular deliveries of fresh bread, baked in mobile bakeries just behind the lines. They had fresh meat, fresh vegetables, real coffee, real cigarettes, chocolate bars. They had ice cream. The Americans had mobile ice cream manufacturing units that could produce gallons of ice cream daily, delivering it to frontline troops as if this were a perfectly normal thing for an army at war to do. Lieutenant Karl Hoffmann, who surrendered to American forces near St. Lo in Normandy in July 1944, described in his interrogation the moment when he understood the true nature of what Germany faced. His unit had been holding a position in the hedgerows under constant artillery fire for 3 days without relief. They had finished their rations on the second day and were subsisting on water and what they could find in the ruins of a farmhouse. On the third day, they were overrun by an American infantry company supported by tanks. Hoffmann surrendered with his remaining 17 men, expecting, based on German propaganda, to be shot or sent to some hellish prison camp. Instead, they were searched, had their wounds treated on the spot by an American medic who used supplies freely: bandages, sulfa powder, morphine for the severely wounded, and were then marched back to a temporary holding area. Within 2 hours of capture, Hoffmann recalled, we were given food. Not scraps, not the minimum needed to survive, but actual meals. Hot stew with meat and vegetables, fresh bread, coffee that was real coffee, and chocolate. They gave us American chocolate bars as if they were nothing. Hoffmann said he watched his men eat, saw the looks on their faces, and knew the war was over. Not the larger war, that would continue for another 11 months. But the war in their minds, the war that sustained the belief that Germany could somehow prevail against the odds. How can you fight an enemy who gives chocolate to prisoners? He asked his interrogator. We were told the Americans were weak, soft, corrupted by their easy lives. But what kind of weakness is it that produces such abundance that they can afford to be generous even to their enemies? But the material superiority, shocking as it was, wasn't the deepest wound to German military philosophy. That came from something more intangible, more difficult to quantify in intelligence reports and after-action reviews. It came from the American approach to warfare itself, from the decentralization of authority that German commanders initially mistook for indiscipline, but gradually came to recognize as something far more sophisticated. The American military, the Germans slowly realized, was built on fundamentally different premises about human nature and military effectiveness. Where the German system assumed that soldiers needed to be molded into interchangeable parts of a machine, following orders without question or initiative, the American system assumed something almost heretical by Prussian standards, that individual soldiers could think for themselves, and that this was not merely acceptable, but desirable. American junior officers and non-commissioned officers were trained to take initiative, to make decisions without waiting for orders from above, to adapt to changing circumstances using their own judgment. More than that, they were expected to do so. An American sergeant or lieutenant who failed to show initiative, who waited for orders when the situation demanded immediate action, would be considered a failure. This was so alien to German military culture that many German officers initially dismissed it as evidence of poor command and control. Surely, they reasoned, this apparent delegation of authority was actually just a breakdown in military discipline, a failure of the American command structure to maintain proper oversight. The reality was far more disturbing. and it began to reveal itself in countless small encounters across every battlefield where Germans and Americans met. German forces, following their doctrine, would establish defensive positions based on careful analysis of the terrain and tactical considerations. They would set up interlocking fields of fire, pre-register artillery coordinates, establish communication lines back to battalion and regimental headquarters. When Americans attacked these positions, German commanders expected to see frontal assaults, perhaps flanking maneuvers if the Americans had enough men and material, but in any case, they expected to see attacks that followed recognizable patterns, that could be anticipated and countered. What they got instead was something that seemed to defy pattern entirely. American attacks rarely came the way German doctrine said they should. A company of American infantry would probe a German position, take casualties, withdraw, and then attack from a completely different direction using tactics that were obviously improvised on the spot. Where German units fought with reference to the plan they'd been given before the battle started, American units seemed to replan continuously throughout the engagement, adapting to what they learned minute by minute. German strong points that should have required major efforts to reduce would be bypassed by American units who simply flowed around them, leaving them to be dealt with later. Weak points in German lines would be exploited with a speed that suggested the Americans didn't need to wait for orders from higher headquarters to recognize an opportunity. The battle for St. Lo in July 1944 provided a particularly clear example of this difference in military culture. German forces had established strong defensive positions in the Norman hedgerows, using the ancient earthen banks topped with dense vegetation to create a defender's paradise. Each hedgerow-enclosed field became a small fortress, mutually supporting with other positions. German commanders were confident that these defenses would hold for weeks, that the Americans would exhaust themselves in frontal assaults against positions that were nearly impregnable to direct attack. And initially, the American attacks did bog down, taking heavy casualties for minimal gains. But then something happened that German doctrine didn't account for. American sergeants and junior officers, frustrated by the hedgerows, started inventing solutions on their own. A sergeant named Curtis G. Cullen welded scrap metal from German beach obstacles onto the front of Sherman tanks, creating improvised hedge-cutting devices that allowed tanks to plow through the hedgerows instead of having to go through the gaps where German anti-tank guns waited. Within days, American maintenance units were manufacturing these Rhino modifications throughout the theater. No one waited for approval from high command. No one filed requisition forms or waited for engineering studies. The problem existed, someone invented a solution, and the Army adopted it immediately. By the time German intelligence reported this new American capability to their commanders, hundreds of American tanks had already been modified. General Major Fritz Bayerlein, who commanded Panzer Lehr Division at Normandy, later described the St. Lo offensive as the moment he understood that Germany would lose the war. It wasn't the material superiority, though, that was overwhelming. It wasn't even the air power, though American fighter bombers had virtually destroyed his division as a fighting force. It was the realization that the American army could evolve, could change itself in the middle of battle, faster than the German army could respond. We had better training, Bayerlein said in post-war interviews. We had better doctrine. Our officers were more professional, our soldiers more experienced. But they could learn and we could not. Or rather, we could learn, but our system made it nearly impossible to translate that learning into action quickly enough to matter. By the time a tactical lesson from the front reached the appropriate level of command, was analyzed, was incorporated into new orders, and disseminated back down the chain of command, the situation had changed. The Americans didn't have this problem. They learned today and changed tomorrow. Sometimes they learned and changed in the same hour. The music was another element that German soldiers found deeply unsettling, though it took time for officers to understand why. American soldiers brought music with them to war in a way that seemed frivolous to German sensibilities. They had portable radios and record players. They sang while they marched, not the martial songs of military tradition, but popular songs from home, jazz tunes, swing music. American military radio, which German forces could easily monitor, mixed news and official programming with hours of popular music. Everything from big band swing to country western to popular crooners. German soldiers, monitoring these broadcasts to gather intelligence, found themselves listening to Glenn Miller and Artie Shaw, to Bing Crosby and Frank Sinatra, to songs about moonlight and romance and missing home. The words were often banal, the sentiments sentimental, but the music had a quality that was hard to define and harder to resist. It was the sound of a world that was confident, that was secure enough in its own values that it could afford to be joyful even in the middle of a war. The American Forces Network broadcast dance music to soldiers in foxholes. This seemed absurd on its face. What use was dance music to men fighting for their lives? But the psychological impact was enormous, both on American soldiers and on the Germans who listened in. There was one song in particular that seemed to haunt the European battlefield in those final years of the war. "I'll Be Seeing You," recorded by multiple artists but perhaps most famously by Bing Crosby, was a simple ballad about separated lovers looking forward to reunion. It played constantly on American Forces radio. German soldiers monitoring the broadcasts heard it dozens of times. Some of them, especially those who had studied English, began to understand the words. "I'll be seeing you in all the old familiar places that this heart of mine embraces all day through." The song wasn't about victory or glory. It wasn't about ideology or national greatness. It was about ordinary life, about the expectation of return, about the assumption that this war was an interruption of normal existence, rather than the defining fact of existence itself. For German soldiers, many of whom had been at war for 5 years by this point, who had been told that they were warriors in a historic struggle that would define the future of their race for 1,000 years. This song and others like it represented a completely different relationship to warfare. The Americans, these songs suggested, were fighting to go home. They expected to go home. They carried home with them in their music, in their chocolate bars, in their letters from girlfriends and wives about ordinary things, jobs waiting for them, plans for after the war, the small details of civilian life continuing in their absence. The contrast with German military culture couldn't have been sharper. German soldiers sang the old military songs, the songs about Prussian glory and fallen heroes and eternal struggle. They were told that they were bound together by blood and soil, that they were warriors in a cosmic battle, that their cause transcended individual existence. This was supposed to make them stronger, this transcendent purpose. But when German soldiers listened to American music, heard American soldiers singing while they worked, saw Americans distributing the latest records to troops at the front, they confronted an uncomfortable truth. The Americans fought just as hard, maybe harder, without the transcendent ideology. They endured just as much, maybe more, while maintaining this connection to ordinary peaceful life. They were willing to die. Thousands of them did die, but they died to protect a way of life that was fundamentally civilian, fundamentally peaceful, fundamentally about individual happiness rather than collective glory. And somehow, this made them formidable in a way that Prussian discipline couldn't match. The machines were the most visible symbol of American power. But even here, what unsettled German observers wasn't just the quantity but the quality and variety, and most of all, the philosophy behind how the machines were used. German armor doctrine had evolved toward building smaller numbers of superior machines. The Tiger and Panther tanks were technological marvels, heavily armored, mounting powerful guns, capable of destroying any Allied tank in a direct confrontation at long range. German tank crews took fierce pride in the technical superiority of their machines. American armor, by contrast, seemed almost contemptible by these standards. The Sherman tank, the workhorse of American armored forces, was undergunned and under-armored compared to German heavy tanks. Sherman crews knew that in a direct confrontation with a Tiger or Panther, they were at a severe disadvantage. German tank commanders racked up impressive kill ratios, sometimes destroying 5 or 6 Shermans for every German tank lost. But here again, German commanders slowly realized they were winning the tactical battles while losing the strategic war. For every Tiger tank Germany produced, America produced dozens of Shermans. More importantly, American armor doctrine didn't rely on achieving supremacy through individual tank performance. The Americans fought with combined arms coordination that German forces, for all their technical excellence, couldn't match. American tanks advanced with infantry support, with artillery support called in by forward observers accompanying every attacking unit, with air support that could be summoned within minutes. When a German Tiger destroyed 3 or 4 Shermans, the American response wasn't to retreat, but to call in artillery strikes or fighter bombers, or simply to bring up more Shermans and overwhelm the German position through sheer numbers and firepower. Oberleutnant Otto Carius, one of Germany's most successful tank aces with over 150 tank kills, described in his memoirs the growing frustration of fighting the Americans in the final year of the war. "Each battle we won," he wrote. "Each time we destroyed more of their tanks than we lost, sometimes many more. But they always had more. And not just more tanks, more fuel, more ammunition, more spare parts, more crews. When we knocked out a Sherman, it would often be back in action within days, repaired by their mobile maintenance units. When one of our Tigers broke down, and they broke down constantly, it might be out of action for weeks, waiting for parts that never came, or it might have to be destroyed by our own crews when we retreated, because we had no way to recover it." But the real difference, Carius came to understand, wasn't just quantitative. It was philosophical. German armor doctrine saw tanks as a precious resource to be conserved, to be employed at decisive moments with maximum effect. American armor doctrine treated tanks as tools to be used, expended if necessary to accomplish the mission. It was the difference between a philosophy of scarcity and a philosophy of abundance, and that difference permeated every aspect of how the two armies functioned. The abundance extended to things that seemed almost absurd. German intelligence reports from late 1944 and early 1945 are filled with observations that read almost like black comedy if they weren't so strategic in their implications. American units, the reports noted, had trucks specifically designated for showering facilities equipped with heated water. They had mobile laundries that kept soldiers supplied with clean uniforms. They had mobile cinemas that showed movies to frontline troops. They had libraries of paperback books distributed free to soldiers. They had entire logistics chains dedicated to delivering mail from home, often with remarkable speed and efficiency, so that a soldier in Europe might receive a letter from his girlfriend in Kansas only days after it was mailed. To German commanders, this seemed like an absurd waste of resources. Military efficiency, they believed, required that every resource be dedicated to direct military effectiveness. What possible military value could there be in showing movies to troops at the front, or ensuring they had access to hot showers, or delivering mail quickly? But what German commanders failed to grasp, or grasped only slowly and with great reluctance, was that all of this abundance served a strategic purpose. It maintained morale, certainly, but more than that, it reinforced the fundamental message that American soldiers were fighting to preserve a way of life characterized by these very forms of abundance and comfort and individual dignity. Every hot shower, every movie, every letter from home reminded American soldiers what they were fighting for and reinforced their connection to that civilian world. This wasn't a distraction from military effectiveness. It was the foundation of military effectiveness, at least for this particular army. The interrogations of German prisoners provide some of the most poignant evidence of the psychological impact of this contrast. Allied intelligence officers, conducting thousands of interrogations throughout 1944 and 1945, noticed a pattern in how German prisoners responded to American captivity. After the initial fear of capture wore off, after they realized they weren't going to be shot or tortured, many German prisoners went through a visible transformation. They were fed with the same rations American soldiers received. They were given medical treatment that was, by German standards of the time, almost miraculous in its effectiveness and the generosity with which it was provided. They were housed in conditions that, while certainly not luxurious, were often better than what they'd experienced in the German military. And the psychological effect was profound. Interrogators noted that German prisoners often became more talkative, more cooperative after a few days in American captivity, not because of any coercion but simply because they'd had time to process the contrast between what they'd been told about Americans and what they were experiencing. The propaganda had told them Americans were decadent, weak, corrupted by their easy lives. The reality was that American abundance came from a productive capacity so enormous it could afford to be generous even to enemies. Hauptmann Werner Pluskat, who commanded the artillery positions defending Omaha Beach on D-Day, survived the invasion and was eventually captured during the Normandy campaign. In his post-war testimony, he described the moment when his understanding of the war shifted fundamentally. He had been wounded during the fighting and was taken to an American field hospital. "I expected the minimum," he recalled. "Enough to keep prisoners alive, nothing more. This would have been correct by military standards. Instead, I received the same treatment as wounded American soldiers. The same doctors, the same nurses, the same medicines, the same care. I had a surgery to remove shrapnel from my leg, and the American surgeon who operated on me treated me as if I were one of his own soldiers. Afterward, when I was recovering, I asked the nurse, through an interpreter, why they bothered to take such care with enemy prisoners. She looked at me as if I had asked a very strange question. "Because you're wounded," she said. "Because you need medical care." As if this were the most obvious thing in the world. As if the fact that I was a German soldier, that I had been trying to kill American soldiers only days before, was irrelevant compared to the fact that I was a wounded human being who needed help. Pluscat said this interaction, more than the battles he'd fought, more than the defeats he'd witnessed, changed something fundamental in how he understood the war. We were told we were fighting for a superior civilization, for a better way of organizing human society. We believed we represented order, discipline, strength. The Americans represented chaos, degeneracy, weakness. But in that hospital, recovering from my wounds while being treated by my enemies with a kindness I hadn't experienced from my own military medical system, I understood that we had everything backwards. Real strength, I realized, wasn't the ability to endure hardship or to impose suffering on others. Real strength was the ability to create such abundance that you could afford to be humane, even generous, even to your enemies. The Americans weren't weak because they valued comfort and individual dignity. They were strong because they'd built a society productive enough to provide these things, even in the middle of a global war. The contrast between German and American military culture became even more apparent in how the two armies dealt with the stress and trauma of combat. German military doctrine acknowledged that soldiers would break under prolonged stress, but the system for dealing with this was harsh by modern standards. Soldiers who showed what would now be recognized as symptoms of combat stress, what was then often called battle fatigue or shell shock, were frequently treated as cowards or shirkers. The German military code was unforgiving of weakness. Men could be executed for desertion or cowardice. Even those not executed might be sent to punishment battalions, units given the most dangerous assignments as a form of redemption through sacrifice. The underlying philosophy was that will could triumph over psychological limitation, that proper ideological commitment would enable a soldier to continue functioning regardless of the horrors he experienced. Mental breakdown was seen as a failure of will, a failure of commitment, possibly even a failure of racial character. This approach, while it might have maintained discipline in the short term, was psychologically devastating in the long term. German soldiers learned to hide their symptoms, to continue functioning even when they were psychologically shattered, because the alternative was worse. The result was an army that, in the final years of the war, was increasingly filled with men who were physically present but psychologically broken, going through the motions of soldiering, while something essential inside them had long since shut down. The American approach was far from perfect by modern standards, but it was revolutionary by the standards of 1940s military culture. The U.S. military, influenced by psychiatric expertise that had been developing since World War I, recognized combat stress as a real phenomenon that could affect even the bravest soldiers. American doctrine called for rotating units out of frontline combat periodically, for providing rest and recuperation behind the lines, for treating combat fatigue as a medical condition rather than a moral failure. The underlying assumption was that every soldier had a breaking point, that combat effectiveness depended on preserving the psychological health of soldiers within the limits of what war allowed. Again, German observers initially interpreted this as weakness, as evidence that American soldiers lacked the ideological commitment that would allow them to fight indefinitely. But what they failed to grasp was that the American system was more sustainable. Soldiers who received rest and treatment often returned to combat effectiveness. Units that were rotated out of line came back stronger. The American military was playing a long game, managing their human resources for a sustained campaign, while the German military was burning through their soldiers' psychological reserves with no thought for the long-term consequences. There was a recording device that American soldiers carried with them, a small object that captured sound on wire or tape, primitive by later standards but miraculous in its time. These devices weren't official issue, but American soldiers' access to consumer goods meant that many of them had somehow acquired these machines. usually sent from home or purchased during leave. They would record messages to send back to their families, or sometimes just record the sounds around them, the chatter of their squad mates, the sounds of camp life, occasionally even the sounds of battle if they could do so safely. German soldiers, capturing American positions, sometimes found these recordings. They would play them back out of curiosity, wanting to know what the Americans talked about when they thought no one else was listening. What they heard confused them. The Americans talked about home, about girls, about plans for after the war. They joked constantly, made fun of their officers, complained about the food despite having better rations than the Germans could imagine. They talked about music, about movies they'd seen, about sports. What they rarely talked about was ideology or grand strategy, or the historic importance of what they were doing. To German ears, accustomed to a military culture where political education and ideological commitment were considered essential to military effectiveness, this seemed to confirm everything they believed about American decadence and lack of serious purpose. But a few German officers, listening to these recordings, understood something their comrades missed. The Americans didn't talk about ideology because they didn't need to. Everything they were fighting for was implicit in what they did talk about. The ordinary civilian lives they expected to return to, the individual dreams and plans and hopes that would have been impossible under the system Germany was fighting to impose on the world. When an American soldier talked about taking his girl to see a movie when he got home, or about the job waiting for him at the factory, or about buying a car and driving across the country, he was expressing the deepest values of American civilization without needing to articulate them explicitly. Freedom for these soldiers wasn't an abstract concept to be debated. It was the concrete reality of being able to make choices about your own life, to pursue your own happiness, to build your own future, and they were willing to fight to preserve that reality, not because some ideology told them they had to, but because it was theirs, and they valued it. This was a kind of motivation that German military psychology had no framework for understanding. How do you fight an enemy who is motivated not by ideology, but by the desire to return to ordinary life, when that ordinary life is comfortable enough and free enough that they genuinely want to return to it? The systematic American approach to warfare revealed itself in countless small details that accumulated into strategic advantage. German forces noticed that American infantry attacks, even those that were ultimately unsuccessful, followed patterns that suggested extensive training and doctrine. American soldiers moved by fire and maneuver, with some elements suppressing enemy positions while others advanced. They used cover effectively. They coordinated infantry and armor at the tactical level, with an ease that German forces, despite their vaunted combined arms doctrine, often couldn't match. But more than technique, what stood out was the systematic nature of American military operations. When Americans attacked, they did so with extensive preparation. Artillery would soften up the target for hours, sometimes days. Engineers would clear mines and obstacles. Reconnaissance would identify German positions. And then the attack would come with overwhelming force at the point of main effort, while the rest of the line held with economy of force. This was war as industrial process, where each step was executed with the goal of achieving maximum results with minimum casualties. German tactical doctrine, inherited from an earlier era, still retained elements of warrior culture, the belief that elan and fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages. American doctrine had moved beyond this entirely into something more coldly rational. The goal wasn't glorious victory, but efficient mission accomplishment. This meant that Americans were often willing to wait, to take time to prepare properly, to use material resources lavishly in order to preserve their soldiers' lives. The German military tradition valued the decisive battle, the bold stroke, the moment when superior leadership and fighting spirit would shatter the enemy's will and win the war in a single climactic confrontation. The American approach, by contrast, was methodical, systematic, grinding. American forces would attack, make gains, stop to consolidate, bring up supplies, and attack again. This pattern repeated itself across Europe through 1944 and 1945. To German observers, this seemed pedestrian, unimaginative. Where was the bold armored thrust deep into the enemy rear? Where was the brilliant maneuver that would encircle entire armies? But what the Germans failed to appreciate was that the American approach, for all its apparent lack of flair, was almost unstoppable. Each American attack might gain only a few miles, but those gains were permanent. The Americans didn't give ground back. They consolidated each advance, brought up overwhelming logistics, made it impossible for German forces to counterattack effectively. It was like fighting a glacier, something that moved slowly but with such mass and inexorability that nothing could stop it. This was warfare as industrial production, where victory came not from brilliant maneuvers but from systematic application of superior resources, repeated until the enemy's capacity to resist was exhausted. By the winter of 1944-1945, even the most optimistic German commanders understood that defeat was inevitable. The question was no longer whether Germany would lose but when and how completely. The Ardennes offensive, the final desperate gamble that Americans would call the Battle of the Bulge, represented Germany's last attempt to achieve something like the decisive victory their doctrine promised. The initial attack achieved surprise and made significant gains against American forces that were thinly spread across the sector. German commanders allowed themselves to hope that this would be like the old days, that shock and speed and fighting spirit would overwhelm the methodical Americans. But the American response demonstrated exactly why German tactical successes no longer mattered strategically. The Americans absorbed the surprise attack, bent but didn't break, rushed reinforcements to threatened sectors with a speed that impressed even German commanders. More importantly, they adapted their response to the specific situation rather than following rigid doctrine. Airborne divisions were trucked to Boasted and held that critical road junction not because this fit any pre-war plan but because field commanders recognized the importance of the position and acted on their own initiative. American forces that were surrounded didn't surrender but fought on, confident that relief would come, and it did come, because the American logistics system could support rapid redeployment of entire divisions in ways the German military, struggling with fuel shortages and destroyed transportation infrastructure, could no longer accomplish. The Battle of the Bulge revealed another critical difference between the two military systems. German forces, breaking through American lines, overran supply dumps and captured American equipment. What they found shook them. The supplies that American units routinely had access to seemed incredible. One captured American supply dump contained more fuel than an entire German division had seen in months. Another contained rations that would have fed a German regiment for weeks. Medical supplies, ammunition, spare parts, all in quantities that seemed absurd for the number of American troops these supplies were meant to support. German soldiers, many of whom were wearing threadbare uniforms and subsisting on starvation rations, found themselves surrounded by American abundance even as they temporarily occupied American positions. They found the famous K rations, which American soldiers complained about constantly, but which seemed like luxury goods to Germans who were surviving on black bread and ersatz coffee. They found the chocolate bars, the cigarettes, the coffee. They found the sleeping bags and the weatherproof jackets, and they understood, perhaps fully for the first time, the sheer scale of American productive capacity. This wasn't just an army. This was the expression of an entire industrial economy, mobilized for war. An economy so productive that it could supply its military with a level of material support that Germany, even at the height of its power, had never approached. The weather cleared after several days, and American air power returned to the battlefield. German soldiers who had fought on the Eastern Front, who had experienced Soviet air attacks, thought they understood what air superiority meant. But American tactical air power in Europe represented something beyond even Soviet capabilities. Fighter bombers seemed to be everywhere, attacking anything that moved during daylight hours. German columns attempting to move forward or retreat were strafed and bombed. German armor, which had achieved initial successes, found itself immobilized by lack of fuel and then destroyed by American aircraft. The systematic nature of the American air campaign was what impressed German observers who survived. This wasn't random attacks by aircraft that happened to be in the area. This was coordinated, with American ground forces calling in airstrikes against specific targets, with forward air controllers accompanying ground units, with the entire system functioning as an integrated whole. By the time the Ardennes offensive collapsed in January 1945, the German military had suffered losses it couldn't replace. Men, equipment, fuel, all expended in a final gamble that never had any realistic chance of success. The survivors limped back to German lines, pursued by American forces that were already preparing for the next phase of operations. The crossing of the Rhine in March 1945 represented the final psychological blow to German military confidence. The Rhine was supposed to be the ultimate defensive barrier, the natural obstacle that would force the Americans to pause, to make elaborate preparations, to give Germany time to negotiate some kind of settlement, short of total defeat. Instead, when the Americans reached the Rhine, they barely slowed down. At Remagen, American forces discovered that the Germans had failed to demolish one bridge, and within hours American units were streaming across. When German forces destroyed the other bridges, the Americans simply built new ones. Engineers constructed pontoon bridges under fire, working with a speed and efficiency that seemed almost mechanical. Within days, the Americans had multiple bridges across the Rhine, with armor and supplies flowing across in an endless stream. German attempts to destroy these bridges with artillery fire, with air attacks, with desperate commando raids, all failed. The Americans would simply repair the damage or build new crossings. It was the material abundance again, the systematic approach, the assumption that any problem could be solved by throwing enough resources at it. And they were right. By April, American forces had crossed the Rhine along its entire length and were driving deep into Germany itself. The final weeks of the war brought German soldiers face to face with the completeness of their defeat. As American forces advanced into Germany, they brought their entire logistics system with them. German civilians, emerging from cellars and bunkers after the fighting passed, encountered something they'd been told was impossible, a functioning military occupation that seemed to operate with casual efficiency. American military government units moved into captured towns and began organizing the basics of civilian administration. Food supplies arrived, rations for displaced persons, medical care for civilians. The Americans set up power generation, water supplies, sanitation. They distributed the famous chocolate bars to German children, a gesture of generosity that was psychologically devastating to adults who had been told that defeat would bring enslavement and destruction. Here were the conquerors, and they brought abundance instead of vengeance. For many Germans, this was the moment when the full extent of the lies they'd been told became impossible to ignore. The Americans weren't monsters. They were well-fed young men who wanted to go home, who treated German civilians with a rough kindness that was completely at odds with the propaganda that had sustained German resistance. The music followed the Americans into Germany. American military radio, which German civilians could now receive freely, continued broadcasting its mixture of news and entertainment, big band music and crooners, the same soundtrack that had accompanied the American advance across Europe. German civilians, many of whom spoke at least some English, began to listen not just for news but for the music itself. There was something in that music, in its casual confidence and its fundamental optimism, that spoke to a possibility many Germans hadn't allowed themselves to consider, that the world might continue, that normal life might return, that there might be a future beyond the rubble and the defeat. The music suggested a civilization that had absorbed this terrible war and remained fundamentally intact, fundamentally confident in its own values and its own future. This was perhaps the deepest defeat Germany suffered, this psychological revelation that the warriors of the master race had been overwhelmed, not just by material superiority, but by a fundamentally different way of organizing human society, one that didn't require sacrifice and suffering and rigid hierarchy, one that believed ordinary people could be trusted with freedom, and that this trust would make them stronger, not weaker. In the prisoner of war camps, German officers had time to reflect on what had happened. The conversations recorded by Allied intelligence officers who monitored these camps reveal a slow, painful process of coming to terms with the nature of their defeat. Some of the older officers never accepted it, clinging until death to the belief that Germany had been defeated only by material superiority, that with equal resources, German military culture would have prevailed. But others, especially younger officers who had actually faced the Americans in battle, went through a process of genuine intellectual reevaluation. They had been taught that discipline was the foundation of military effectiveness. They had seen an army that operated with what looked like indiscipline, where soldiers chewed gum and listened to jazz and questioned orders, and yet this undisciplined army had crushed the Wehrmacht. They had been taught that hardship built character and strength. They had faced an army whose soldiers expected hot showers and ice cream, and yet this soft army had proved harder in battle than the hardened veterans of the Eastern Front. They had been taught that ideology and commitment to a transcendent, made soldiers willing to sacrifice everything for victory. They had faced an army whose soldiers just wanted to go home, and yet these citizen soldiers who were fighting for nothing more than the right to return to their ordinary lives had shown a courage and determination that matched or exceeded anything German ideology had produced. The conclusion some of these officers reached, often expressed obliquely in their monitored conversations, was that the entire German military philosophy had been based on false premises. The rigid hierarchy, the unquestioning obedience, the subordination of individual will to collective purpose, these things hadn't made Germany stronger. They had made Germany brittle, unable to adapt, unable to allow the individual initiative and flexibility that modern warfare demanded. The emphasis on hardship and sacrifice hadn't created superior soldiers. It had created soldiers who endured until they broke and then broke completely. The ideological indoctrination hadn't provided motivation superior to simple human desires for freedom and dignity and normal life. It had created a motivation that was hollow at its core, that couldn't survive contact with the reality of what Germany had actually been fighting for. The Americans had won not despite their democratic chaos and their material abundance and their individualistic culture, but because of these things. Their system worked better because it was based on a more accurate understanding of human nature, because it trusted individuals to take initiative, because it maintained soldiers' connection to the civilian life they were fighting to preserve, because it used material abundance to make war more bearable, and therefore made soldiers more resilient. In the summer of 1945, after Germany's surrender, an American military historian conducted interviews with captured German generals for a project assessing German military effectiveness. One interview, with a general lieutenant who had commanded a panzer corps on the Western Front, produced a statement that captured the German officer corps' painful reckoning with their defeat. "We believed we were the best soldiers in the world," the general said. "We believed our training was superior, our discipline was superior, our tradition was superior. And in terms of what we thought soldiering meant, we were right. Our soldiers were more disciplined, more obedient, more willing to endure hardship without complaint. Our officers were more professional, more educated in military history and theory. Our doctrine was more sophisticated, and yet we lost completely and utterly." You asked me to explain how this happened. I have had time to think about this question, and I believe I understand the answer now, though it is painful to accept. We lost because we were fighting the wrong war. We were fighting a war where discipline and endurance and professional military skill were the most important factors. The Americans were fighting a war where adaptability and material superiority and systematic application of resources were the most important factors. They understood modern war better than we did. They understood that in an industrial age, war is an industrial process, not a contest of warrior virtues. They built their military around this understanding, and we did not. And that is why they won and we lost. The general paused, then continued with what might have been the most difficult admission of all. But it was more than just understanding modern war. It was the society that produced their army. We despised American culture. We thought it was decadent, materialistic, lacking in the spiritual qualities that we believed made a nation great. We thought their emphasis on individual freedom made them weak, that their soldiers would never accept the discipline necessary to be effective in combat. We were wrong about everything. Their society, with all its apparent chaos and materialism and individualism, produced soldiers who were effective precisely because they carried their society's values with them. They fought as individuals working together by choice rather than as cogs in a machine working together by compulsion, and this made them more flexible, more adaptable, more resilient than we ever understood was possible. They maintained their humanity even in combat, and this made them stronger, not weaker. We tried to turn our soldiers into something more than human, into perfect instruments of the state's will. They kept their soldiers human, and the humans defeated the instruments. The symbolic object that haunted the German understanding of their defeat was something simple and ordinary, a chocolate bar. It appeared everywhere in accounts of German soldiers' encounters with American forces. The chocolate that Americans gave to captured Germans. The chocolate that American soldiers seemed to have in limitless supply. The chocolate they handed out to children in occupied German towns. It was such a small thing, such a trivial thing, and yet it represented everything that Germany had failed to understand about its enemy. The chocolate represented abundance, the productive capacity that could supply frontline soldiers with luxury goods. It represented generosity, the confidence of a civilization that could afford to give gifts even to its enemies. It represented connection to civilian life, to the world of peacetime pleasures that American soldiers expected to return to. It represented American culture itself, informal and egalitarian and materialistic in the best sense, concerned with ordinary human happiness rather than grand historic destinies. German soldiers had been told they were fighting for a 1,000-year Reich, for the supremacy of their race, for their place in history. And they had been defeated by men whose primary concern was getting home in time for Christmas. Men who brought chocolate bars to war. As the sun set on the Rhine on that March evening in 1945, as American forces continued their crossing, while German forces fell back in disarray, General Major von Leuben sat in his command post and wrote a final report to his superiors. He knew it didn't matter anymore, that the war was lost and these reports would change nothing. But he wrote anyway, trying to capture what he had learned, what he had seen. The Americans do not fight the way soldiers should fight, he wrote. They have no concept of Prussian discipline. They question orders. They make decisions independently. They seem to treat war as simply another job to be done, not as a sacred calling. And yet they win. They win because their system trusts them to think for themselves. They win because their society produces an abundance we cannot match. They win because they maintain their connection to civilian life and civilian values even in combat. They win because they understand something we never did, that in modern war, the society that can keep its soldiers human, that can keep them connected to what they're fighting for, that can maintain their morale through material comfort and democratic dignity, rather than through ideology and discipline, that society will prevail. We lost this war the moment we failed to understand that discipline without initiative is brittle, that hardship without purpose is unsustainable, that ideology without connection to genuine human needs is hollow. The Americans understood these things instinctively, without needing to articulate them as principles. Their way of war came from their way of life, and their way of life was stronger than ours. He never sent the report. Instead, he folded it carefully and placed it in his breast pocket. And the next morning, when American tanks surrounded his position, he walked out to surrender with his hands raised, carrying nothing but that folded piece of paper, his final assessment of why German military excellence had proved insufficient, why discipline had lost to freedom, why the warrior culture of Prussia had been overwhelmed by the democratic chaos of America, why the side that had chocolate bars and jazz music and hot showers had defeated the side that prided itself on its ability to endure suffering. The paper survived, and decades later, historians would read it and recognize it as something rare, an honest accounting by a professional soldier of the moment when he understood that everything his military tradition had taught him was incomplete, that the American way of war, which had seemed so unmilitary and so unbusinesslike and so lacking in proper seriousness, had actually been the most serious and the most effective military system of the age. The Americans had won not by becoming more like German soldiers, but by remaining most fully themselves, practical, individualistic, materialistic, democratic, confident that freedom and abundance were not signs of weakness but sources of strength. And they had been right.